Welcome to the Inkscape Master Series, a series of more advanced Inkscape lessons. In this lesson, we'll learn all about how to use clipping and masking, including all of the lesser-known features like inverse clipping, inverse masking, and clip groups. We'll then put to use what we learned by creating this coffee poster. The purpose of clipping in Inkscape is basically to hide or clip out parts of objects, and to do clipping, we need at least one object being overlapped by another object. Now we can select all of the objects and either go up to the Object menu, then down to Clip, Set Clip, or we can simply right-click the objects and choose Set Clip. So what it did is it used the top object as the clipping path or the clip, and it clipped out all parts of the bottom object that were outside of the clipping path. And this is treated as a single object, so we can move it, scale it, and change the colors like we could any other object. We can also actually still modify the shapes of the original objects. If we go to the Node tool, or a Shape tool if the clipped object is a shape object, we can get either the nodes or the handles for modifying the clipped object shape. And if we go to the Node tool, we can toggle on this button in the controls bar that says Show Clipping Paths of Selected Objects. And now we also get the handles for modifying the clipping path. If we want to unclip the object, we can either go to Object, Clip, Release Clip, or right-click the object and choose Release Clip. This gives us the original objects back, but they will maintain any shape or color changes we applied during the clipping. If we have more than two overlapping objects and set the clip, it will use the topmost object to clip all of the objects under it. But if we release the clip, we can see that it actually created a duplicate of the topmost object to use as a clip for the bottommost object. If we would rather use a single clip for all of the bottom objects, we can first select the bottom objects and group them by pressing Ctrl G. Now if we overlap the group with the top object, select both the group and the top object and set the clip, it will clip the group. And if we release the clip, we can see that it didn't create a duplicate of the top object. Similarly, we can use a group of objects as the clipping path. We can also clip out parts of an image. This is great for removing the background of an image. For example, I can use either the pen tool or the pencil tool to trace around the bird here. Select both the image and the tracing path and set the clip. And now I have just the bird. Now if I wanted to clip this further, like maybe clip out everything but the bird's head, clipping an already clipped object just replaces the clip, which probably isn't the result we're looking for. To get around this, I can undo that and group the clip object first. Now if I select both the group and the object I want to use as the clip and set the clip, I get the result I'm looking for. If I want to release all of the clips, I can first right-click the object and choose Release Clip, giving me the clip and the group back. However, if I right-click the group, there's no option for releasing the clip. Instead, I have to first ungroup it by choosing Ungroup here. Now if I right-click again, I can release the clip. Another thing to note is that if we apply something to a clipped object that normally extends beyond the bounds of the object, like certain types of filters, or by blurring the object, the effect will also get clipped. However, if I group the clipped object first, now the blurring will work like normal. Inverse clipping is basically the opposite of clipping, as it will clip out everything inside the clipping path. To do inverse clipping, we can select two or more overlapping objects and go to Object, Clip, Set Inverse Clip. If we release the clip of this, it gives us both objects back, but the top object is now invisible. To easily unhide the object, we can right-click inside its bounding box and choose Unhide Objects below cursor. If we set the inverse clip again, another difference with inverse clipping is that it's actually a path effect. If we open the Path Effects dialog, we can see that the object has the Power Clip path effect attached to it. And we can even toggle between inverse clipping and normal clipping with the inverse clip checkbox down here. If we turn this object into a path, it finalizes the Power Clip path effect, but the object is still actually clipped. If we release the clip, instead of getting the original top object back, we get an object that covers the entire bottom object, but with the original top object cut out of it. Setting a normal clip with these two objects gives us the same result we previously got by setting the inverse clip. One thing I like to use inverse clipping for is to remove the background of an image that has a solid color background like this one. Because inverse clipping uses the path effect, however, we can't apply it to an image. Instead, we can open the Trace Bitmap dialog, go to the Multicolor tab, change the detection mode to colors, set scans to something a bit higher, make sure stack is checked, and click apply. And now we have a group of paths that matches the image pretty well. We can then go to the Paint Bucket tool here and click inside the background, and it will fill in the background with a single path. If we have some other parts we want to fill in, like here inside the flower, we can hold Shift and click it, and it will add that part to the big path. The path doesn't quite reach the edges though, so we can use the Pin tool to create a path around the edges like so. Then select both paths and union them together. Now we can select both the path and the group and go to Object, Clip, Set Inverse Clip, leaving us with just the flower. To create a clip group, we can right-click an object and choose Set Clip Group. It seems like nothing happened, but what this does is it groups the object, then clips the group using a copy of the group itself. We can double-click the group to enter into it, and if we add more objects to the group, they will be clipped as well. If we enter into the inner group, which contains the original object, we can move and resize the original object to change the location and size of the clip. And if we add more objects to the inner group, we can change the shape of the clip. A fun thing we can do with clip groups is clip objects to the page. First, we can turn on snapping, then create a rectangle covering the entire page. Now we can turn snapping back off, then right-click the rectangle and choose Set Clip Group. If we enter into the group, we can hide the inner group here by turning off its fill color. Now if we create an object inside the clip group and give it a color, we can see that any parts outside of the page get clipped. Masking actually works mostly the same way as clipping, but with masking, the color of the top object or mask affects the opacity of the bottom object. The darker the mask is, the more transparent the bottom object will become. Likewise, the brighter the mask is, the more opaque the bottom object will be. To set a mask, we select one or more overlapping objects and either go to Object, Mask, Set Mask, or right-click the objects and choose Set Mask. So the bottom object was clipped by the top object, but because the top object was gray, the resulting clipped object is partially transparent. Notice, however, that the object still appears to have 100% opacity in the Fill and Stroke dialog. If we release the mask, which we can do either by going to Object, Mask, Release Mask, or by right-clicking the object and choosing Release Mask, then change the top object to black, select them both and set the mask, the object becomes fully transparent. And if we use white for the mask, the object will be fully opaque, giving us the same result as clipping. Also, like with clipping, we can go to the Node tool to modify the original bottom object. And next to the Show Clipping Paths button in the controls bar, we have a Show Mask of Selected Objects button, which, if we toggle it on, it lets us modify the mask. We can also use gradients with masking. For example, if we duplicate an object and give the duplicate a black to white linear gradient, then select both objects and set the mask, the bottom object will now go from being fully transparent on the left to fully opaque on the right. If we release the mask, we can go to the Gradient tool and adjust the gradient line to change the direction in which the bottom object changes opacity. We can also do this with radial gradients. An additional feature of masking is that if we blur an object and use it to mask another object, the blurring will show up in the result. I like to use this feature with images. For example, I can first draw a path around the bird in this image, give it a white fill, and turn off the stroke. I could then go to Filters, Blurs, Feather. With this, I can add a slight blur to the edges of the path. Now if I use this path to mask the image, I get just the bird and the edges are nice and smooth. This looks much better than if I just did clipping instead, which ignores the blur. We can also use an image as the mask. It doesn't have to be a grayscale image, but the result would be better. Now if I put this image on top of another object, select them both, and set the mask, the various shades of gray in the image affect the transparency of the colors throughout the object. I can even do something cool like give the object a gradient. For the most part, inverse masking does the opposite of masking, and to use it, we select two or more overlapping objects and go to Object, Mask, Set Inverse Mask. So it basically left alone the parts of the bottom object that were outside of the top object and affected the transparency of the parts that were inside the top object. Like with inverse clipping, inverse masking is a path effect, and if we go to the path effects dialog, we can see it uses the power mask path effect. However, if we look down here, it appears that inverse masking isn't even turned on. If we check this option, it looks like the result we would have gotten with normal masking. This is because inverse masking actually works in combination with a background that gets added to the mask when we had the Add Background to Mask option on. By default, the color of the background is set to white, and as we move it toward black, we start to get back the result we had previously. With a black background, if we uncheck inverse mask, it goes back to normal masking. We can also do this by checking inverse mask again and turning off the Add Background option. This can definitely be a bit confusing, so I recommend trying it out with various shades of gray for both the mask color and the background color and see what you can come up with. Let's see how we can use inverse masking to cut the flower out of this image like we did with inverse clipping. And like with inverse clipping, because inverse masking is a path effect, we can't use it on images, so we can first use trace bitmap to convert the image into a group of paths. I'll use the same settings as I used in the inverse clipping section. Now I'll go to the Paint Bucket tool, click the background to fill it in, then hold Shift and click this area here to fill it in as well. We also need to create a path to cover the parts that didn't get filled along the edges. Now union these paths together. I can also add the feather filter to this to smoothen the edges a bit. However, this pulled the path away from the flower. So I can go to Path, Dynamic Offset, then go to the Node tool, select the node here, and press the up arrow key once or twice to outset it just a bit. And I need to turn this back into a normal path by going to Path, Object to Path. Also, because I want to hide everything but the flower, I need to use black as the fill color of the path. Now I'll select both the path and the image, and go to Object, Mask, Set Inverse Mask. And there we go. Now we have just the flower with nice smooth edges. Now we'll create this coffee poster by using what we learned throughout the video. Let's first set the size of the page to the size we want for the poster by going into the document properties. I'll change the units here to pixels and set the width of the page to 1280 and the height to 720. We can also turn off the page's border if we want. Now we can close this out. Next, we can turn on snapping and create a rectangle covering the whole page. Then we can turn snapping back off. And let's create a clip group with the rectangle by right-clicking it and choosing Set Clip Group. Now let's go to the Select tool and double-click the group to enter into it. Because we'll be covering up the inner group here, it doesn't matter too much what the color of it is, but just in case we want to lower the opacity of the poster's background later and make it darker, we should make the group black. Okay, for the background, let's import an image. I'll use this image of the top of a desk. In the description below, you can find links to this image and every other image I used in this video. We can scale it up some while holding Control and adjust the positioning of it inside the clip group. We also don't want this image to stand out too much in the poster, so let's give it a slight blur. Around 10% looks pretty good. Next, we'll add a glass morphism effect to the poster. First, we need to duplicate the image by right-clicking it and choosing Duplicate. Let's blur this one even more. About 20% should work. Now let's create a rectangle inside the poster. Let's round the corners a bit. We're actually going to be using several clones of this rectangle. Using clones will allow us to resize the glass card at any time without causing problems, as we'll see later in the video. To clone the rectangle, we can either click this button in the commands bar or use the shortcut Alt-D. Okay, now we have a clone of the original rectangle. And if we resize the original rectangle or change the corner radius, the clone will be altered as well. The clone will also by default use the same color information as the parent. This is a problem for us because we're going to need to change the colors of the clones. In order to make this possible, we have to unset the parent object's colors first, which we can do by clicking the question mark button here in the Fill and Stroke dialog. Let's make sure the stroke color is also unset. Now we're free to change the colors of the clone. This clone was actually just for demonstration purposes, so we can delete it. Let's select the original rectangle again. Let's center it on the page by opening the Align and Distribute dialog, setting the anchor to page, and clicking these two buttons. We're actually just going to be using this object to resize its clones, and we don't want it to be visible on the poster, so we can lower it to the bottom of the clip group by clicking the Lower Selection to Bottom button up here. However, we still want to be able to access it easily, so let's open the Layers and Objects dialog. Okay, so here's the rectangle at the bottom of the list. Let's double click its name and change it to something like Glass Original, so we'll be able to locate it easily later. Okay, with the rectangle still selected, let's clone it again with Alt-D. We want to use this rectangle to clip the image under it, so let's hold Shift and select the image, then right-click and choose Set Clip. Now we want to clone the original rectangle again, so let's select it in the Layers and Objects dialog and press Alt-D. Let's make this one white, and lower its opacity to about 40%. Next, we'll use an image to give the glass card a bumpy texture. For this, let's open up the Import dialog and import this frosted glass image here. Let's make it cover the entire poster and give it a slight blur. Now if we hold Shift and Alt and click in here where the rectangle should be, it will add the rectangle to the selection. We can now right-click and choose Set Mask. Okay, let's open up the Import dialog again. Let's also add this image of coffee beans to the card. First, we can scale it down a bit while holding Control to maintain the aspect ratio. And now we want to use another clone of the original rectangle to clip this image. So let's go to the Layers and Objects dialog and select the original. And let's clone it with Alt-D. Then let's use the clone to clip the coffee bean image. And I'll lower the opacity to about 25%. Next, we'll add a cup of coffee to the poster. For this, let's open up the Import dialog and import this coffee image. First, we of course want to clip the background out of the image, leaving us with just the cup. Let's do this by creating some shapes to cover the cup. To begin, we can create a circle over the main part of the cup. I'll raise the opacity of it a bit and change the color so I can see it better. Let's also create a rectangle over the handle of the cup. I'll make the corners a bit less rounded, then rotate it to fit the angle of the handle. Now we can select both of these shapes and union them together. If we use the path to clip the image, however, the edges won't look very good. Instead, we can feather the edges of the path a bit, then use masking. First, we want the path to be white with 100% opacity. Then let's go to Filters, Blurs, Feather, and add a slight amount of feathering to it. Now we can select both the path and the image and set the mask. Okay, now we can scale it down a bit while holding Control and put it where we want it on the poster. We can also add a drop shadow to the cup. We'll use the drop shadow filter for this, but because the image here is masked, the drop shadow will also get masked. So first we need to group this by pressing Ctrl G. Now let's go to Filters, Shadows and Glows, Drop Shadow. In the Options tab, we want to have the shadow type set to Outer, and in the Blur Color tab, we want to have the color set to black and the Use Objects Color setting turned off. Also, an opacity of around 70% should be good. Now we can go back to the Options tab, check Live Preview, and adjust these settings a bit if necessary. I think that looks pretty good, so I'll click Apply and close this out. Next, we'll add a reflection of the coffee cup to the bottom of the glass card. But first, we're going to want to resize the card. As I mentioned at the beginning, because we've been using clones of the original rectangle for the card, we can simply select the original rectangle in the Layers and Objects dialog and resize it, and it will resize all the clones as well. I want to keep the card vertically centered in the poster, so I'll hold Shift as I scale its width. We can also go to the Squares and Rectangles tool and adjust the corner radius, and it will adjust it for the clones as well. Okay, for the reflection of the cup, let's first duplicate the cup, then let's flip it vertically by pressing the V key, then move it down here while holding Control. Let's also click the lower one step button to put it below the other cup. Next, we'll make it so the reflection becomes more and more transparent from top to bottom. And we of course don't want the part below the card to be visible. To do this, we can create another clone of the original rectangle and give it a white to black vertical gradient, then use it to mask the cup. But before we can apply another mask to this cup, we need to first group it with Ctrl G. Okay, now let's select the glass original in the Layers and Objects dialog, and let's clone it with Alt D. Let's make it white, then give it a linear gradient fill. Now we want to go to the Gradient tool and move the first stop to near where the cups meet. Then grab the other stop, hold Control, and bring it down to just above the bottom of the rectangle. Let's make the stop black with 100% opacity. Now we can select the rectangle and the bottom cup, then set the mask. Now one thing we might want to do is make it so the coffee beans here don't show through in the reflection of the cup. To do this, let's first duplicate the cup reflection object. Now in the Layers and Objects dialog, we currently have our reflection group selected. We want to open the inner group here, then right-click the image object in here and choose Release Mask. This gives us the original image and the path we created to first mask the image. We only want this path, so let's bring it up outside of these two groups, keeping it inside the clip group at the top here. Now we can delete the rest of the reflection group in here. Alright, we can now use this path as an inverse mask to hide the parts of the coffee bean image that are under it. Because we want to hide something with the mask, we need to change it to black. Also, because the coffee bean image has already been clipped, we first need to group it with Ctrl G. Now we can select both the coffee bean group and the path and go to Object, Mask, Set Inverse Mask. Alright, now we can no longer see the parts of the coffee bean image under the cup reflection. To finish up the poster, we can add some text to it. And if we want, we can lower the opacity of the background image to make the poster a bit darker. And we can double-click the canvas to get outside of the clip group. Okay, thank you very much for joining me in this Inkscape Master Series class, and I hope to see you in the next one.